Sorry, do you mean if I just jump in here to make an adjustment? I'm going to go straight up under here, under the jacket.
No, we were just discussing it.
Introduction, like a hello, welcome type thing.
Yes, please. I would like to introduce
Go.
the Darren, otherwise it would be all as one other one person. But it's under advice, under an advisory. So he's joining us from, he's joining us remote. We're delighted to have him.
Okay.
Okay, it's
And where is the
No, Snam is okay. So if you could also remind me, if you could do just a 20-minute welcome to those of us watching.
Yeah.
Just, thank you. And are we ready?
Well, it's great. Possibly off. So, as you can see, we have one member of our panel who couldn't make it. He is a member of Parliament. We'll bring him in, but we're going to mute him for now until we bring him in, because otherwise the noise is a little deafening. I'm Rob Cox. I'm editor of Reuters Breakingviews, a financial commentary arm of Reuters. I've been parachuted into this thanks to my friends at Snam. Thank you, Marco and Camilla. But I'm actually, as they know, I'm kind of really interested in hydrogen, and I guess you guys are too. And we're gonna ask the question: is it the fuel of the future? I'm gonna give you guys each just 1 minute to introduce yourselves and tell me just really quickly what's the single most important question I can ask of you to make this really easy. So I'm gonna start with you, Paddy.
Paddy Padmanathan, President and CEO of ACWA Power. The question that you can ask is, when will we get grey hydrogen and green hydrogen at the same price level?
Good question. Okay.
David Livingston, I'm a senior advisor to Secretary Kerry. His role is Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. And I think today, I'm looking to dive deeper into exactly how these markets are going to develop. You hear a lot of people talking about pipelines. You hear a lot of people talking about shipping. You have a lot of people talking about the need for an LNG moment in the hydrogen market. So I'm always curious to learn more about how those markets are going to develop.
Excellent. Great.
I'm Greg Jackson, founder and Chief Executive of Octopus Energy Group. And maybe you should ask about the role of government.
Oh, yeah, they do have a role, don't they?
Well, all the questions have been asked, so I'd like to think about supply and demand, which comes first, chicken and egg, that whole dilemma.
Okay, and then we'll bring in our member of parliament. We can unmute you for your introduction.
Talking about the need for an LNG.
I'm always very conscious when I'm on the screen of an enormous face. Sorry about but my...
Marco, I'm going to ask you a question. Yeah. Sort of before I get to like, how big an opportunity, financial opportunity, is this? Because I'm quite curious as to how much we see in the marketplace. A lot of anything that has like H in the hydrogen, all of a sudden the stocks have gone bonkers and bananas, and there's this great expectation that as the transition is going to lead us to green hydrogen, which is renewable, as it were, and non-emitting, carbon non-emitting. But it's not yet here. Like, we're not there.
Yeah.
We're not. It is the fuel of the future. How big an opportunity do you see it from a financial perspective?
So I think the convergence now is finally that electrification can only get to about 50% of the energy mix. That remaining 50%, which people haven't really focused on until we're beginning to talk about net zero, because you can simply worry about electrification. People are now beginning to realize that remaining 50%, or 40 or 55, it doesn't really matter, is going to be about half kind of electricity-based fuels, mainly hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives, and the other half kind of biofuels of some sort. So we're talking about a fully decarbonized system in 2050, or 2070 if you're in India. So that's a long-term opportunity. To get there is, some people say 20, 30, 50, $80 trillion, like too big to put in my chart. But the risk is now we have a hype and people are beginning to front load a lot of that. I mean, it's going to take a while. So Paddy asked you to ask him the right question, which is, how long is this going to build? Because this reminds me, I left Goldman Sachs to start a telecom company. We were trying to do cloud computing in 2000. And this is exactly the same feeling. Everything that had the .com would just go through the roof in valuations, billions of dollars raised, funds. Everyone was just pouring money at things, regardless of what the underlying business proposition was. So the hype, I think, is a risk for the hydrogen economy. We need to really take it a step at a time, but at the same time, do what Roosevelt did in 1935. Manhattan had been electrified by 1882, and 50 years later, only 10% of rural homes in America had electricity because of inertia. We have huge inertia in the system. And so FDR set up an agency, and in the next 15 years, he brought it from 10% to 90%. So the opportunity, the reason G20 COPs are really, really important, and the reason policy is really important, is we can not make it happen in 5 years instead of 50 years, but we can really accelerate it significantly because we need to break the inertia.
So how do we get that? That green premium is sort of the question you're asking. So now it's what, $6? What is the cost of green hydrogen versus?
Yeah. So today, methane reforming fossil fuel-based hydrogen generation, 100 million tons is dealt with in the world today. $1.60. Well, right now, because of the gas prices, it may be much higher.
A kilo.
A kilo. $1.60 a kilo is probably about the right average number. So you're right. Very small quantities, something like 200,000, 100 million tons of grey hydrogen, 200,000 tons at best of green hydrogen produced in little electrolyzers built in the back of a garage. It's used today for various reasons, and that's around about a $6 a kilo. So the opportunity is, the question is, how quickly can we get to $1.60? If you look at the way solar energy costs have come down, if you look at the way wind energy costs have come down, if you look at the way anything else that you use costs have come down, everything is exponential now. We live in technology is driven exponentially. Costs are brought down exponentially. 75% of the cost of producing green hydrogen, plus or minus, is the cost of electricity. Electricity at an average level using fossil fuel, take out all the subsidies and confusing stuff, across the world, and not bad a number to think about, is kind of like 7 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. In certain parts of the world today, we can generate renewable energy entirely by solar and wind, and the wind blows at night too, so you can stretch the period over which you can use that, 17 hours, at below 2 cents per kilowatt hour. Look at the difference in numbers. So all of a sudden, you have such a low cost of renewable energy coming into the production of green hydrogen. Our view is that on the first plant itself that we can do at scale, so the first plant that we have already gone into construction on is something that is going to be bigger than all the capacity, 240,000 tons per year, bigger than all the capacity of what is being produced today.
And this is in Saudi Arabia?
In Saudi Arabia, right at the top end of it. It's a
NEOM.
Yeah, partnership with Air Products, who are very much in the business of grey, so they understand the hydrogen business, and with NEOM, the region, as one-third partners, and that is a 2.2 gigawatt electrolyzer complex fueled by 4.4 gigawatts of renewable energy. Now that itself will halve the price of that first one of the kind of numbers that people talk about today.
So supply itself,
Yeah.
you're saying will reduce the market price, as it were,
very
but that's still 6 to 3.
on one project.
Yeah. Okay. So as capacity's expanded.
Look at what happened with solar and wind. As more and more capacity got used, more and more supply chain innovation came in, competitive tension, more innovation went in. All the prices got crashed.
How do the economics work? Yeah. Okay. We'll get to that. But then what about bringing the price? The other point is this maybe get to the government part of it. Tax policy, that subsidies or those kinds of things can be used to actually narrow the differential as well.
If you narrow the differential, you will obviously accelerate the market uptake, you will accelerate the multiplication of these type of projects, and you will then drive the cost down even further faster. That's all.
So is that happening?
Not yet.
So maybe this gets to your question. What's the role of government, Greg?
Yeah. I think the role of government is to stand back for a bit, because the reality is that we're making the same mistakes during this transition as we've seen so often in technology transitions, which is we're trying to use renewables, clean energy as a light-flight replacement with fossil fuels, and the reality is they're entirely different. Yeah. So the very quick analogy for me would be the start point is energy systems around the world, and by which I mean like natural gas pipes and electricity generation are based around rectangular thinking, right? So you turn on a power station, you get rectangular power, you turn it off. Brilliant. If you're a grid operator, you've got a demand curve like that, it's static, and you meet the need by making rectangles that stack up to that. That's the way everyone thinks. And so they love, for example, a lot of the stories about hydrogen at the moment are what a great way of turning the spiky behavior of renewables, or in the case of solar, the sort of very nice kind of curve of renewables, into a rectangle. But the reality is this technology, actually, the technology of renewables, fundamentally changes the way in which we can consume energy. And the start point should be, let's make the most of it while it's electricity. So first of all, we re-engineer our systems to make the most of it. And the great news is consumption is changing at the same time as generation. So for example, electric vehicles, you've got massive discretion about when you charge them. So increasingly, as we electrify things, and I use electric vehicles as an example, but loads of industry will work the same, loads of thermal behaviors will work the same. You can grab ultra cheap green electrons when they're abundant. Now, there's a limit to how much of that you can do. And that's the point at which then we start saying, right, we take the spike that's left over that we can't use, and we're making hydrogen, we use that to fill the gaps, which, by the way, will be much, much smaller once we've done this. If government works now, I don't know how many of you were around during the e-commerce revolution, but yeah, we talked about these technology changes. When Tesco first went online in the UK, you did your order on the website, and the back end, it spat out a fax that went to someone at Tesco. They would print out, right, they'd take a pile of faxes, go and pick them, and then they type into an email to confirm what you got, right? That's the stage right in the energy revolution. The problem is, if governments get too involved now, they're subsidising fax machines, rather than standing back and seeing quite where e-commerce can take us.
Darren, as a member of the British government, what is your response to that? He's just saying, no, we don't want you involved.
Well, I was going to say, I quite like to be a government, to be honest, because then I can actually do something as a fool ourselves that we can just do everything ourselves in the UK for our own domestic needs, that it's going to solve all of our problems, and that government is just going to tell everybody what the answer is.
David, let me ask you. I mean, what is the U.S. approach to nurturing the hydrogen economy, or the onboarding of hydrogen in the country?
Well, hopefully the U.S. approach is actually relatively consistent with what we've heard from sort of the private sector leaders up here. I mean, we're starting from a broad viewpoint. We're starting from setting the direction of travel, setting a vision, and then working backwards from that on trying to figure out what is the right stage to start setting appropriate market signals and policies to help deliver on that vision. But the vision is clear. We've got something that the Department of Energy launched earlier this year called the Hydrogen Earthshot, which has the goal of delivering, as crazy as it may sound, we think it's possible, $1 per 1 kilogram of clean hydrogen in 1 decade. So in other words, by the end of 2030. That's 1 for 1 in 1 for the very first element of the periodic table. Now, what's this going to look like? Obviously, there will be supply side measures, right? And that's where the president's infrastructure goals are so important. And that package,
Is it part of the package that's in front of the Senate?
There will be some potentially some hydrogen elements within that package that I think are going to be quite important.
Not just the hot air that we get from the Senate.
That's right. In addition to that, you already have existing structures that can help,
actual hydrogen.
They can help deliver on that. The 45Q tax credit, for example, can be used to help support carbon capture that can drive blue hydrogen forward in the United States. And I think we've got the scale. I think we have the gas prices. I think we have a number of different factors that make the United States potentially a very attractive scale player in blue hydrogen. In addition to that, you've also got, of course, you can have tax credits for renewables that can help drive the United States as a green hydrogen, champion as well. Now, in addition to this, we also realize that it's not just a supply side equation. It's not just about getting a bunch of renewables on the grid, getting carbon capture moving. You also need to show the demand signals. We heard that. We were in Saudi Arabia, saw Paddy there with Secretary Kerry just a couple of weeks ago. And we heard, from multiple stakeholders there sort of show us the demand, right? We look to Saudi Arabia so often and look to the Gulf, look to the Middle East and say we want supply security for traditional energy markets. They look at us now in this emerging hydrogen economy and they say, show us demand security, right? So how are we doing that? Well, just yesterday, Secretary Kerry, a couple dozen CEOs launched something called the First Movers Coalition. This is all about generating demand for green products in steel, cement, shipping, aviation, trucking, etc., 2030 demand, that then over this decade we can work to scale up the supply that can meet it. This is, I should be clear, the single largest demand side initiative for advanced clean technologies that's ever existed in world history that was just launched yesterday at COP26. So we're focusing on 4 sectors initially: steel, aviation, trucking, and shipping. All of these have potential hydrogen solutions to play. And in some of them, like shipping, hydrogen is, sort of plays a critical role. You probably can't do it without clean hydrogen. Now, the final thing I should just mention is that we believe also in sending a clear signal that we're talking about clean hydrogen here. So we're not going to sort of, we're trying not to be picky, right? It's not, we've got to focus on green, we've got to focus on blue. We don't want to fight those battles. Let's be less sectarian about this and more ecumenical.
I mean, there is definitely an internecine warfare over this question, it seems. I mean, every time I've jumped into the hydrogen debate and mixed up my blue with my gray with my green, it's like a slap in the face.
And folks forget about nuclear to hydrogen. Folks forget about gas pyrolysis, right? The point is, let's be ecumenical with a single focal point, which is carbon intensity. The planet doesn't care about colors. The planet cares about how much greenhouse gas is in the atmosphere. So let's focus on that and just get it done.
So use case is an interesting thing. Can we talk about that a little bit, Marco? I mean, you and I have talked about this a bit before, but and Greg, I want to bring you into this because I know you have a slightly different vision than I had about hydrogen, which is David mentioned steel. Okay, like that is, there's just no way you can imagine steel without something like hydrogen, something with that kind of that intensity. Trucking. Heavy transportation, these things. I mean, are we wrong in thinking that like there's a specific use case for it that, or does it go beyond that?
Look, I think there's a so-called hydrogen ladder. So a lot of people are trying to craft what the use cases are.
And people like to talk more about the differences than the convergence. I think in the kind of industrial, scientific, academic community, there's no question that steel needs hydrogen. There's no question that shipping and some form of aviation needs some form of electric type fuels. There's no question that cement, like extreme heat, just not because of a necessity, but because of a cost convenience in certain parts of the world, will use big hydrogen. In my mind, there's no question that the bulk kind of seasonal storage can never, and maybe we'll talk about that later, can never be an electron. There's no point putting electrons in lithium for like months. And then you, as you enter trucking, then you have to start to make a difference. Is it long distance trucking? Is it short? Like so, vans will be batteries. Longer distance trucks will be both. Yeah. But the bottom line, or homes, like people argue, is it going to be a boiler or a heat pump? Who cares? Like that's important for the home, but you know the truck is going to be an electric truck, full stop. If it has a battery
how that
or
electricity
a fuel
is produced is the.
If it has a battery or a fuel cell, you can even swap one for the other. If a car has, you know, it can be the same chassis, the same engine, the same look, the same feel, the same electronics. Frankly, I don't really care if I know people get more excited about boilers and cars than about steel plants. But the bottom line is, on 80%, there's a consensus.
Greg, you're a boiler fanatic.
I love boilers. No, look, I mean, first of all, I should say, rather than government tax carbon, right? We should have said that, right? Because then we'll solve all the problems through the market,
absolutely.
right? So to be really clear, that's the very simple. Don't pick winners. Just tax the problem. Yeah. And make sure we tax the problem end to end, so that when we're talking about clean, we really are talking about clean. But then when we talk about uses, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's hard to see uses for, a lot of industrial processes that don't use hydrogen. And at the other end, and trucking, short distance trucking in a dense country, probably battery electric vehicles. Long distance trucking in a country like Australia, probably hydrogen, right? I mean, who knows, but that's probably going to find its level.
400 truck things that go through the middle of the outback.
And they've got a very long way between charging stations. So, but I mean, who knows, right? It will find its level. And I think that's really the first plea, was we need to let things find a level. Because let's say, as a thought process, that the UK, as an example, moves to heat pumps rather than hydrogen for home heating. So we will need an awful lot of wind generation to meet our winter needs, particularly given there are lulls, right? And you might not need, in seasonal storage, you might only need a week or two storage, right? If you've got enough generation for that, then you've got 8 or 9 months a year when electricity is near enough free, right? There is so much abundant electricity. Now, how do industrial processes reinvent around that, right? And to what extent can they use direct, almost free electrons? Or can we be generating tremendous amounts of very, very cheap hydrogen? And actually, does that mean you end up with a hydrogen economy? I mean, we don't know the answer. What we do need to do is rapidly move in the direction that lets those compounding forces drive prices to a level that lets the market find the right solution.
It's interesting what you said about taxing hydrocarbons. I mean, it's not. It's sort of everyone dances around that in a place like COP. That's my sense. And Darren, I mean, maybe you can give a perspective on whether, from a government perspective or from the perspective of the House of Commons, what appetite there might be for kind of actually moving forward on this in some meaningful way.
The Treasury here in the UK.
Does that mean?
You need border adjustments on tariffs. But actually, are we going to do that by ourselves? Probably not. We've seen how long it's taken to get some resolution on a global approach to digital taxation. We really need to make some progress on an international approach to carbon taxation. That's
interesting. The OECD took, something like more than a dozen years to finally come together, and now we've got this agreement. But it doesn't. If it takes that long to come up with these kinds of taxes. What about the U.S., David? I mean, I'm going to give you a slightly more controversial question, which is, when Donald Trump wins in 2024, and everyone looks back and says, okay, I mean, we've come to, your government is moving forward, I mean, just really accelerated, almost as if those 4 years didn't happen, right? We're back in the Paris Agreement. You know, Senator Kerry and your team really have been out front leading much of the diplomacy around this. The U.S. is back in the game. Like, how worried should people be that the U.S. goes the other way? Or is what is being implemented now, is this train left the station, you know, what's the horse one? You know, like it's gone. Like there is no going back. I mean, what's your perspective on that?
Well, I appreciate you wrapping the controversial question in a nice sweetener. So let me swallow the medicine. Look, I mean, it's a good question, and it's a question that others are asking us. Let me be very frank. Other counterparts now ask us that question because the last 4 years changed the paradigm through which we think about these things. And I'm going to say to you, instead of obfuscating, I mean, just directly, can I predict who's going to win the next election, who will be sitting in the White House? Or you just did for me. Well, let's say this. Look at some of the policies that matter the most for U.S. hydrogen leadership. The 45Q tax credit when it comes to carbon capture. This was a tax credit that when it was put in for power plants was supported by both Democrats and Republicans, enjoys widespread bipartisan support, is supported by Senator Manchin, right? So, okay, check that one off.
The most important guy at COP?
There are two, yeah. I won't say. I won't say. The second one is, on the green side, right? What is the renewable policy that actually a surprising number of Republicans also support that also enjoys bipartisan support? Tax credits. Tax credits for wind, tax credits for solar, increasingly tax credits for energy storage, and tax credits for hydrogen, I'm sure, also enjoy similar bipartisan support. So check that box as well, right? And then if you think about it, actually in the United States, much as if you look at the EU as an aggregate whole, right, a lot of energy policies actually set at the state level and not in Washington. So there are some things that Washington can do in terms of setting the direction of travel, working on harmonizing standards, for example, ensuring that, we've got a common approach and a common platform with the EU, with the UK, to the degree possible, so that we create an aggregate transatlantic market that can really move this technology forward as fast as possible. But states also have a really important role to play. And one of the hidden benefits, let's say, of the past 4 years is that the sort of reaction of much of the United States to the lack of U.S. leadership on the global stage under the Trump administration was to create these sort of antibodies of state level, local level, and corporate leadership that we in the Biden administration are not trying to replace. We're trying to actually amplify and empower because we know that we need a diverse fabric of allies and policies moving forward on this. And so I think, yes, will you see certain changes and swings back in Washington inevitably over the years to come in one way, shape, or form. I can't predict how or when or where. But we actually have pretty well ingrained into the bipartisan fabric of the United States the policies necessary to drive towards that hydrogen Earthshot goal of $1 per 1 kilogram in 1 decade.
I think it's a really, your point about the sort of institutionalization, the antibodies is a great analogy, way to think of it. When you think of the corporate sector, I mean, the corporate sector has moved, it's not going backwards. My sense in talking to CEOs, talking to investors, it is happening, and no matter what Her Majesty's government or whatever the U.S. government does, your government, the government in Saudi Arabia may have a little more power, but it's happening. And I don't know. I mean, do you see this, Mark? I mean, Mark, you're
look, the Earthshot that David was talking about, $1 a kilo. Just to be clear, this is cheaper than coal. So what we're saying, and what David is saying, what the Department of Energy is saying, what Paddy is saying, is that we can make clean hydrogen cheaper than coal before the end of the decade. And that's the only way we can get China and India off coal. And this is like the best business proposition that has existed in the energy space, since I don't know when. So that's transcending governments. That's beyond COP, beyond G20. That's just pure industrial logic. Now it can take us 30 years to get there. It can take us 10 years to get there. And we will get there only if we ramp up the demand for the electrolyzers, as Paddy was saying, to bring that cost down as fast as possible.
Yes. So the administration changes. I mean, okay, that can all happen.
But in the meantime, the costs come crashing down. Money will talk, bulldogs will walk, no issue. market will dictate. In the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the lowest cost oil producer in the world, within the next 9 years, we will be shutting down 42 gigawatts of oil-fired power plants. That's kind of like roughly 50% of the power generation capacity will get shut down. Oil-fired, in the cheapest producer
solar
of oil. All of that is getting replaced with renewable energy. Why? Yes, very concerned about carbon, I mean, for sure, but it is the most cost-compelling thing to do. Even in that place, it is more, the cost of taking that cheapest oil out of the ground, processing it and putting it at the power plant, is more than the cost of just producing renewable energy. So that's where we've got to with renewable energy, and that pretty much is a very large part of the world. So it's not just in Saudi Arabia, by the way. That's right across the world now. Hydrogen will get to exactly the same place. We're just starting. Renewable energy started in earnest, I don't know.
70s?
Yeah, no. In
I think
earnest,
Jimmy Carter. I'm
in
really old,
earnest,
so like-
sorry, no. I would
My
argue.
dad put solar
I would
panels on the
argue
roof.
renewable energy in earnest started maybe 15 years ago. Okay. In earnest. And the other thing that I think you can see is that, just like what Marco pointed out earlier on, with the right policies, you can accelerate very fast that adoption and reduction in cost. And what we live in an exponential sort of technology era where everything moves faster. We innovate. Look at how fast we produce all these vaccines. Unthinkable. Even 5 years ago, it would have been unthinkable. So that is what is going to drive the cost down. So forget about it.
Just two quick things, and Mark, forgive me for slight controversy. I think you described that as being the best energy story, the greatest energy story. I'd say it's the second greatest, because Paddy just described the first, which is renewables themselves.
Yeah.
And that's because I think the hydrogen story begins with the renewables, and that's why the first thing is, if we can use an electron while it's an electron, then we'll get the very best value. Then we end up enjoying the second best, which is hydrogen. And they're great comparison. Yeah, great, that's fantastic. The second thing I was going to say quickly on that, just in terms of time, is around the world, really, I think we could end up with a race between which governments can enable routes to market faster. Now, the reality is in the UK, to Darren's point, whether the UK ends up with a big hydrogen economy or not, who knows? But at the moment, we can build a colossal, very, very cheap wind farm in a year. It takes 7 years, roughly, nearly minimum, to get the permissions. And that's not just planning permission from people who increasingly don't mind having attractive, elegant wind farms on their hills. It's actually, especially if they get cheap electricity, right? But secondly, I mean, actually, it's the incredible barriers to entry presented by monopolies, and forgive me for this if there's anyone in the room from it, but people like National Grid and those that we absolutely are forced to work with, who work at a pace that was determined 20, 30 years ago, not a world of the exponential change we have today. And I think that leads to 2 problems. One is the time. So will we end up importing, in the UK, for example, hydrogen from Saudi Arabia because they're able to get to cost quicker than we can build? It's very, very possible.
Fewer permissioning issues.
Exactly, fewer permissioning issues, right? But by the way, not necessarily the best solution, right? No criticism to Saudi Arabia, I'm just saying, like, from a total economic point of view. And the second is that, back to this not having a like-for-like replacement, our current energy system is largely planned by people whose mentality is set in the world as it was. And it's a bit like asking Nokia to kind of determine what we're going to do with the iPhone. And it would be a very, very bad outcome. And I think a great risk we have is that one.
So actually, I wanted to ask about Saudi. I mean, there's this. It's interesting what you say. The notion that Saudi Arabia can transition itself to be a net exporter of energy, clean energy, is I mean, that's just a fascinating concept. Is it? What needs to happen for that to be a reality? I mean, what you don't. You are creating in NEOM this extraordinary facility, but the rest of the world's like, as Greg's saying, they're like, are they going to want to cede even more security and power to Saudi Arabia, given questions around energy security that have been abundantly clear for years?
Yeah, energy security has been abundantly clear for many years, but yet over the last umpteen decades, Saudi Arabia has been a reliable provider of energy to the world and continue to balance the market, whatever. But so in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia now, there's a publicly stated policy that at least 9 more plants of this size will be developed within the next 9 years. Okay, that's the Kingdom's policy. We don't see, having started the first project, we don't see the impediment for that. All the kind of land availability, resource availability work has been done. So how do you just move on? I think we can work with people like Snam, who run the European network, to put pipelines across. So even moving that hydrogen to the markets is not an impediment. Initially, we'll be moving it by converting it, very complicated, convert it to liquid ammonia and then put it into a ship, take it to the other place, reconvert it back to hydrogen, put it in the fuel cell, da-da-da. But we don't need to do that, I think, fairly quickly now, because I think we are busy trying to establish the feasibility of just running pipelines. So what is stopping it? I think at the end of the day, the first one, we've worked on the basis, build it, they will come. It's the first one, no, for sure. It's a no-brainer. Maybe a few more we can do, but the market needs to then pick up. It needs to start getting absorbed. And then we do need to find a more efficient way of getting the hydrogen across to the point of consumption and dislocating some of the industrial capacity to the point of production. There's a very good reason why steel mills are in Germany, because that's where the coal was. Oh, that's where the coal is. And they use coal for that. There's no particular reason why now we need to be shifting the hydrogen to Germany to make.
Well, why not just make the coal or make the steel in Saudi Arabia?
Well, yes, why not?
Yes, sir.
I think it's part of MBS's plan.
No, but look, whether it is in Saudi Arabia, whether it is in Morocco, whether it is in Oman, whether it's in Chile, whether it's in Australia, these are all places where you can produce hydrogen. The resources are fantastic. Abundant land, creditworthy environments, very stable. So I think you will have both. I think it is unrealistic to expect certainly people to move. So I mean, so we still have to find the way of getting hydrogen across long
distance. We're going to open up the questions in a second. So rev up your questions. I have one though for you guys. I don't know who wants to take it. Who's going to be the John D. Rockefeller of hydrogen, green hydrogen, besides Marco? Besides Paddy and Greg. I mean, you guys are in government. Yeah, you have to take.
Can I say something with having a Paddy, a David, a Greg, a Marco, whatever? I hope that the John D. Rockefeller of hydrogen is not any of us up here, but is a woman. I hope the John D. Rockefeller of hydrogen changes the face of what this looks like. I mean, I'm speaking against my own interest here, but it's simply to say that if we want, we need to make sure that as we transition to kind of this better energy sector, that we also transition to a more diverse one as well.
That's a worthy point for sure.
And one, good. And one other observation I would make: think about resources have pretty much been democratized now. It's everywhere. The sun shines pretty much everywhere in different intensity, whatever. But so we take renewable energy is being produced in smaller, can be produced in smaller quantities because big solar farm, small solar farm, big wind field, a small wind field. Hydrogen electrolyzers units. So over time, it's very possible that there will be no John D. Rockefeller.
So everybody has their own sort of thing in their backyard.
I think in this energy revolution, you will end up with more power to the consumers and less to the producers.
But to David's point, I mean, right now, though, the things you guys are talking about have huge capex.
That's the start.
Elements.
In order to drive
$8 billion for yours in NEOM. I mean, that's it's going to be hard for any entrepreneur, much less
in order to drive the cost down. That's what you need to do.
Yeah.
To get it at scale, get the production going. But once you've got it going, there's no particular reason why you need these massive projects. You should be able to produce green hydrogen in smaller quantities at multiple locations.
I did it in middle school, I think.
There you go. All of us
didn't everybody do that little experiment where you separated oxygen
exactly.
from hydrogen and then blew
there you
it
go.
up?
There you go. Yeah.
Okay, do we have any questions from the audience? And if so, please raise your hand and you will be delivered a microphone. We have one down here.
I think it may be.
Good afternoon, Barry White, until recently Chief Executive of Transport for the North, looking at transport in the north of England. Transportation, I think, both heavy bus, heavy goods vehicles, very natural markets for hydrogen. You've talked a lot about the supply side, but apart from sort of carbon taxes, there, I think, is a very big role for government to subsidise the initial adoption of hydrogen vehicles, for instance, bus, truck, because without that, at the moment, they're just too expensive. So I accept government should try and keep out of markets generally as a good notion, but I do believe there's a big role in promoting demand. I'd just like some views on that. So,
cool.
Who wants to take that question? Darren. Oh, hold on one.
Darren.
Okay, go. Oh wait, no, he's still on mute, I think.
So I accept.
You're good.
Okay, great. I was just saying, my general view on how should we spend taxpayers' money, because let me tell you, there are millions of people, well not millions, but there are loads of requests coming into the Treasury for different things across the whole different economy. So how do you do it? My general view is that it needs to be part of a coherent industrial policy where we recognise why taxpayers' money is important and on what basis the outcomes are, and really importantly leveraging private sector finance.
You're good. Yep. I think he's hearing a readback. Okay, another question. Or does anybody else want to handle it? Greg, maybe.
No, please.
I would disagree. I think the challenge is if the government decides it's going to subsidise hydrogen for buses, as an example, then the government's chosen that hydrogen, and probably a particular form of hydrogen, particular technology, in a particular way, is going to be the right answer. Actually, for example, and by the way, I speak as a company who are investing, we invested 50 million quid of our own money in electrolyzers, co-located with transport in the UK, co-located with our own generation. So to be really, really clear, I've got a dog in the game. I'll fight. But I think that what they should do instead is just say, look, 20% of your fleet, 40% of your fleet has to be zero carbon, however they kind of decide to set the limit. And then you have to do the work of identifying what you think is economically most efficient. And that creates a sort of competitive process in which each of the bus operators is driving technology improvement. And I think time and again we see our history littered with taxpayers' money wasted on the wrong decision because you didn't have contestability in the solution.
Can I just double?
Yeah, please do.
Say to that point, that's exactly what we're trying to do with the First Movers Coalition. This has some of the biggest companies in the world, and why that matters I'll come back to. But you've got Amazon, you've got Apple, you've got Maersk, you've got DHL, you have Lafarge Holcim, you have some of the largest industrial players and some of the largest consumers of things like steel and aluminum and trucking and shipping in the world, right? And so when you take them and you say, and they commit publicly to say, for the first time ever at this COP, 10% of our steel procured will be zero carbon steel in 2030. 5% of all of our goods shipped, period, Amazon, will be on low carbon, ships or ships using low carbon fuels in 2030. And the key thing is here, we're parameterizing. I won't go into the details here because it'll bore you, but we've done months and months of work to parameterize exactly what the definition is for each of those sectors. And the definition for each of those sectors is designed so that you cannot meet those goals with technologies that exist today. There are technologies that, let's say, do exist but are not at commercial scale that you're going to need in 2030. So the whole idea of this initiative is it's driving to market, to commercial scale, the sort of next-gen deep decarbonization technologies. So it's fine if you're using, sustainable aviation fuel that offers a 10% carbon reduction, 20% carbon reduction. That's great. Continue to do that for the next several years. But the First Movers Coalition is all focused on getting to market, let's say, sustainable aviation fuels or electricity or whatever hydrogen, whatever else it may be, that offers an 85% carbon reduction or more. And I think that's absolutely critical. And then what you do with that demand signal, why does that demand signal matter? It's not just for show and tell. It's not just to have a COP deliverable. It matters because then you have a credible off-taker. You can take that to the financial sector, and you can actually lower your cost of capital for driving into the market the supply to actually meet that demand. Because you've got this chicken and egg problem, and we're trying to solve that chicken and egg problem directly with this sort of demand signal.
Another question? I think we have one here. Gentleman in the back.
I'm not in Dorchester. I might sound strange because I run a charity, but 20 years before that in transport.
I think your mic might not be on.
No, it's on, but
oh, it is?
Is that better? No?
Just speak loud.
I'll just speak out loud, yeah. So, hi, I run a charity. We work with the most vulnerable parts of the community in the highest deprived areas. So going to your point, my diversity would be, I'd prefer a poor person that was actually in charge of this, because they're the ones who tend to get left behind. So my first question, as we do this just transition, how are we going to make sure it's just? My second question, so now I'll take you back into my transport experience. In 2005, we tried to introduce hydrogen buses into Hackney. In 2012, I tried to buy hydrogen ships into Scotland, and I ran into the same issues that actually I'm planning on a horizon of 20 to 25 years, and I'm having to make a decision now, and I don't know what it's going to look like. So I suppose, what's changed? What do you think's changed? Because Amazon dictating what they're going to do doesn't necessarily change it for the rest of the society. So if you look at those two questions for me, that would be useful.
Can I take the first?
The just transition, yeah, go for it.
So you all have this. If you just go to page 229, you don't have to bother reading the book. Just go to page 229, and this sums it all up. And what we're saying when we talk about $1 is that we can have green hydrogen in the UK, in Europe, at below $25 a megawatt hour. That's a quarter of the price that we're paying today for natural gas, which is very high because of China and post-COVID. But it's even lower than what we were paying pre-COVID for natural gas. So the ultimate goal is to get cheaper energy into people's homes. But how do we get there, and how do we avoid the terrible mistake that we did? The UK, Germany, Spain, and Italy single-handedly put solar subsidies at $800 per megawatt hour flat for 15 years. That created energy poverty, because we put those on the bill, and when you do that, it's really unfair, regressive form of taxation. Because you're giving the money to the landowners and you're taking the money from the poorer people disproportionately. So the reason why we're all pushing on the first movers, on the green hydrogen catapult, which is a supply side alliance that Paddy's a member on, and why we're all collaborating, is to avoid putting a flat subsidy and then sending all the manufacturing to China like we did for solar, and start from the supply side. So on this chart you see that we've identified that with 50 gigawatts of supply, and ideally we build the factories in the UK, in Italy, in Europe, we can get the cost down without going on people's bills. That's why we need to get the off-takes that David is working towards with Amazon, with Apple. We need to get the solar panels built that Paddy's doing. We need to get the midstream infrastructure. But the end goal is much cheaper energy, not just cleaner energy, but cheaper energy and more reliable. Starting from the solar and the wind that are falling on their own. So the whole economics, this theory that we're all talking about is to change the paradigm, not worry about a more expensive net zero world, but worry about a cheaper net zero world and delivering that as soon as possible without putting levies on people's bills.
Could you just come back a little bit, because that's a different paradigm. The poor get poorer. Yeah, so my challenge is, how do you get it into those communities that need it now, who don't have the infrastructure around them, who don't have the voice, and are not heard in the same way? Because you'll get your price down, but then there's going to be, like you touched on in terms of boilers, and you look at, communities that cannot afford to pay for those boilers, or communities that don't have a house, that don't. It's that paradigm, I think, more than the price paradigm. I understand absolutely the price paradigm. How do you get it to those that need it quickest?
Can I just say, so your question was, because I think you did not, your question was basically, how do you recruit, the least advantaged in our societies into these transitions? And I absolutely agree with you. But it's not just about, Marco made a great point, which is basically the future. If I could write a new subtitle to his book, I would call it Clean, Cheap, and Dispatchable. That's the future that we want, all three of those things. And that's what clean hydrogen can deliver. That's exactly what everyone up here is working towards. But to your point, it's not just enough that for consumers, you're getting heating which is cheaper and cleaner, et cetera, et cetera. It's also that we need to make sure to recruit the least advantaged in our communities into the projects that are delivering this, into the infrastructure that's delivering this. That infrastructure is running through and generating jobs and economic growth and activity in those communities that have previously been left behind over the past 20 years, right, over the past several decades. To that end, this is why, at least in the United States, I'll say, President Biden has actually targeted a defined percentage of all of our clean energy investment that's going to be taking place in the United States through infrastructure bill and beyond into disadvantaged communities. Is it the most economically efficient outcome? Perhaps not. Perhaps it's not the most, on paper, economically optimized sort of way to spend. Is it ultimately for the best for society? Does it make sure that the political economy of this transition is durable and sustainable and not as volatile? Absolutely. And is it the right thing to do? 100%. So I think that those sorts of things, not just on lowering costs, but also in terms of where we're putting projects, where we're building infrastructure, who we're recruiting to work on that infrastructure, et cetera, we need to be thinking about not leaving those communities behind.
I think that's all we've got time for. I want to thank our panelists. I thought that was a really fascinating discussion, and anyone who was watching live streaming, and our Member of Parliament who was remotely logged in. Thank you very much.